Should we just start, or will you give a heads up? Or
It's 11:30. Alrighty. Whenever you're ready.
Okay, great. I'll just go ahead then. My name is Sabina Pultz, and I'm an assistant professor at Roskilde University at the Department of Humans and Technology. And I will be talking today about unemployed people and what the Corona crisis means for unemployed people. So the overall question I would like to raise is, who's to blame now? It sort of investigates how responsibilities and the understanding of responsibility shifts during the crisis. So right now we are embarking on this new empirical study, and I would like to use this talk now with you guys as an opportunity to help qualify the study and identify perhaps blind spots or questions that should be raised that we haven't raised, and so on. But the overall frame is that we've just started gathering empirical data, looking into what does this Corona crisis means for how unemployed people are governed, and then also how they govern themselves. So my background is that I'm a psychologist, and I did my PhD on unemployed people, investigating from a governmentality studies perspective matters of privatization of the unemployment issue, how unemployment is increasingly understood as a psychological problem. One example is that unemployed people are sometimes portrayed as unmotivated. They don't want to find jobs. So it's a matter of enough motivation to be unemployed. And then this crisis came along and sort of shifted the dominating ways we talk about unemployment. During the last at least 3 decades, there's been a real emphasis on the responsibility of the self. So when a person becomes unemployed, it's become a matter of that person's fault. And this view and understanding of the subject has been supported and underlined by the development of social policies in the area, largely described as the activation paradigm. In many ways, we have all these instruments and measures to get people to actively take on the responsibility for their situation as unemployed people. And then this natural experiment suddenly appeared out of the blue, and all of this surveillance and control of the unemployed people were suddenly put on hold. And that gives us this insight into how do these active labor market policies actually work? What are their effects? How do they affect unemployed people psychologically and in other ways as well? So as a consequence of the Corona crisis, people no longer have to live up to a number of demands regarding activity for one. For instance, they have to apply for 2 jobs per week, and also demands of availability, that they have to stay at home and be available to the labor market the next day. And that means that people don't travel very, very much, or if they travel, also just inside the country, they have to report to the system that that's what they're doing. So all of this was suddenly put on hold. And I'm curious to see with my associate, his name is Magnus Poulsen Hansen. He's also working at Roskilde University as an associate professor there. So we're interested in investigating how do these ALMPs work and how do they affect subjectivity. And one way of getting to know more about that issue is to see and look into what happens when they're suddenly not around. How do the unemployed people experience that? So in a broader perspective, investigating unemployment is tied to a lot of relevant agendas. There is enormous state expenditures and real grave individual consequences of unemployment. In these years, we are looking into a changing labor market with more and more temporal project employments, temporary employments, and so on, which has been termed the precarity or the academic precariat, as Guy Standing coined it. According to that, education is not longer really a protection against unemployment. It hits, everybody. And along the lines of these temporary employments, intermittent periods of unemployment perhaps will become even more normal than they are at the moment. That said, it's also quite evident in the literature that unemployment causes poorer mental and physical health, and in many cases, being unemployed scars people for a long time. One of the explanations for these consequences is the tight link between identity and work. So when you do not have a job, all of a sudden in our society, it's also understood as a lack of social status and a lack of identity. The broader perspective also involves, in my case, looking into this area as a link between policy development and the production of subjectivity. So even though unemployment is often understood as a loss of job, as a deprivation, as Marie Jehoda also described it, Tom Boland and Ray Griffin have been among important contributors to show that it's not just a matter of a loss, it's also a matter of this unemployment space as being highly governed. You're not just left all alone and it's up to you what to do. No, you have to live up to a number of demands, and how you feel and how you conduct yourself is closely tied to what is asked from you. So the link between policies and subjectivity is also something that's guiding us in our investigation. We also come from, or I come from a social psychological perspective, and if coming from there, it seems that social phenomena, the meaning of any social phenomena is not a natural given. It's a matter of how meaning is negotiated in a local context. And largely you could, or roughly put, you can distinguish between whether unemployment primarily is understood as society's fault or the individual's fault. And even though it will always be a mix in particular periods of time, one of these understandings have dominated the others. And there will be these hegemonic understandings of unemployment. In a Danish context, this historian Rune Engelbrecht Larsen in 2013 wrote this book in which he investigated the patterns of these understandings, and he characterized that from 1500 to 1900, unemployment was largely understood as individually caused, and laws and policy were aimed at threatening and motivating people back into work. During the 1900 until 1990, we witnessed the labor movement, which really improved the conditions for workers. And in that period, unemployment was largely understood as something that was undeserved and something that was just an effect of a capitalist society. And tied to this notion or understanding, social policies are aimed at giving citizens safety until they're back into work. And then we saw this change around 1990, 1993. It was particularly in a Danish context, And since then, unemployment has, to a large degree, been associated with the individual and the individual fault. It's also been tied to discourses of laziness and undeservingness, and following those lines of thoughts, there's a lot of control and surveillance technologies that's been introduced and mobilized. So it's sort of this pattern from deserved to undeserved, back into deserved. In Denmark is a particular case. We are in this panel a very international crowd, so I feel like I have to say a little more about the country context. So in the Danish welfare state, we have this flexicurity system that sort of very renowned because it's it's a system that secures enormous flexibility for employees. They can very easily hire and fire employers. They can easily hire and fire employees because there's a social security system that's aimed at giving citizens a level of safety so they're not marginalized, and this system is also universalistic, meaning that every citizen has a right to be economically compensated if they're unable to provide for themselves. And then since the 1990s, this activation paradigm was introduced, and increasingly the responsibility of unemployment was placed on the individual. The model, the flexicurity model, has been challenged quite a bit, and Rasmus Willig, a Danish sociologist, has said that the flexibility part of our flexicurity system has increased. We're told to be even more flexible than in the past, and at the same time, the security part has impoverished quite a bit, which resembles patterns we see in many countries with an overall retrenchment of the welfare state. So right now, a couple of years ago, the unemployment period was shortened from 4 years to 2 years. It takes double the amount of time to earn the right to receive unemployment benefit again. And there are increased demands of availability and activity. So overall, this results in a worsening of the terms for the unemployed people. And that's sort of the background for my talk today. So I made a PhD called It's Not You, It's Me, Governing the Unemployed Self in the Danish Welfare State. And that particularly looked into what are the psychological effects of this activation paradigm. What does that mean for how people conduct and govern themselves? And one of the findings from that one was that it was particularly private aspects that became the object of intervention in the unemployment system. And in that sense, unemployment has been constituted as an individual or perhaps an interpersonal issue. And in C. Wright Mills terms, this means that it goes from being a public issue to a private problem. I won't go into much detail about the theoretical framework for these studies, but it's overall it's using governmentality studies, and that means that the analytical tools are investigating this link between what Foucault calls technologies of power. Among them are the policies used in the system and technologies of the self. So there are all these laws and rules in the system, but what do they actually mean to the individual, and how do the individual navigate in relation to these? One of the effects of the activation paradigm was to get the unemployed person to understand him or herself not as some passive recipient of money from the state, but to become an active agent, an active job seeker. And this logic is, I don't know, visible in so many areas, but among them, it's visible in the way that unemployed people are encouraged to understand themselves when they meet the system. I have a quote from my PhD that sort of taps into to some of these workings and what they do to how this dude Søren understands himself. So I'll just read the quote. I've learned to call myself an active job seeker. It's probably because my wife is a social worker. I mean, in my head, I'm unemployed. I have the feeling that I belong to this club of losers. The first time I went to one of these meetings, I felt like I was at an AA meeting. Nothing negative about that, but the feeling of sitting with a lot of people and it's sort of a club for the outcasts. This is a club for losers. It's no fun being around other unemployed people. It differs according to which group you're in. I was at a 3 days course at Niels Brock, this is a business school, and that was an entirely different segment. Everybody was looking for a job, but it was another group and motivation. It was actually interesting instead of these standout groups with a lot of middle-aged women and men who got fired because they simply aren't good enough. Perhaps they are good enough, but I feel that this is the club for people who aren't good enough at what they do. I comfort myself saying that we're graduates. I was sitting next to a girl, she was also a graduate, and we could see it was the same feelings. It was weird being there. You sit and listen to a woman in her 40s who's talking about the ethical problems about using her network. I mean, I really don't need that. So one of the takeaways from this quote is that there are a lot of othering processes going on. And one thing is between people who are working and the unemployed people. But another crucial division or subdivision is that among the unemployed people, there are also different groupings. And here this guy, Søren, distinguishes between motivated and unmotivated unemployed people, between unemployed people and active job seekers, the ones who are actually doing something about their problem. And then the quote also, I think, illustratively shows how the representation of the unemployed person is also associated with a lack of competence. It's not randomly that these middle-aged women and men got fired. It's actually because they got it not good enough. So that's part of what unemployed people are met with as they become unemployed. On the other hand, and this is quite paradoxical, the activation paradigm has also paved the way for a lot of what I term empowerment technologies, also inspired by a whole range of authors. So here we look at a map of the Unemployment Insurance Fund. And I don't know if the PowerPoint is big enough, but the rooms are named after big cities around the whole world. So I'm not sure if we have any cities from Egypt or India today, but we have Stockholm and Buenos Aires and New York and Bangkok and so on. And when people become unemployed, they often have to go to a welcoming meeting on the first floor in a room called Buenos Aires. So that's sort of, I think, paradoxical that that there are also these empowerment technologies going on at the same time as people are sort of negatively affected by becoming unemployed, because it's also associated with, for instance, an understanding of not being very competent, not being very motivated, not being sufficiently proactive. Another thing that we see is that there's this positive recoding going on. So you don't see the word unemployed very often in the system. Instead, you have to sort of present yourself as in between jobs or as open towards new possibilities. There's all these euphemisms going on, which is tied to what I term an effect to, I don't know, sort of trying to get people to talk about their objective skills in an effective discourse. They have to not only show their papers, their education, or their CVs, they also have to be passionate about how they want a job, how they like to work, and what they want to do for the workplace, and so on. So there's this kind of fun meme where the interviewer says, "Why do you want this job?" And she says, "Passion being able to limit to what likely to be candidate onto the market. And this is, of course, in stark contrast to the fact that unemployed people are quite often governed through fear. They are often told that if they don't live up to the rules and demands, they can get economically sanctioned. They can lose their money, and that scares most of them. They're scared of losing their livelihood. There's also what you might term mistrust in the system, built in the system, and that has the effect that a lot of people feel under suspicion when they're unemployed. It's as if other people suspect them for not doing enough, and that's sort of tied to this, all of the control and surveillance we've installed in the unemployment system. Okay, so far it's been kind of paradoxical what's going on in the system. There is fear, mistrust, but also empowerment and motivation, and the fact that you're told to look at yourself as a small enterprise, as me incorporated in the more sort of neoliberal or enterprise culture, as Rose calls it. But then the corona crisis and on the entire field, and the activation policies have been suspended during the crisis, and actually our Minister of Employment said it's not the unemployed people's fault. So in that sense, there's been a shift of responsibilities, and these days we witness a whole new language about the unemployed people. And one way of understanding it is that during crisis, people tend to be more solidaric with the vulnerable. So it might just be sort of something that's happening right now while the crisis is still going on, something that might disappear quite quickly after the crisis. But at the same time, we also see that this might actually be a good time to start thinking differently about how we govern unemployed people. And it has, I think, the potential for reducing stigma among the unemployed people. So right now we are in the midst of interviewing unemployed people, both unemployment benefit recipients and social assistance recipients. And we've also done a survey. Overall, the question is, how do these unemployed people experience the crisis? What does it mean when these demands are put on hold temporarily? And some of the areas of interest we are exploring is how do they feel? How do they manage? Do they blame themselves or do they blame others for the situation? Do they actively seek jobs even though they are not, even though they do not have to do it right now? Are they actually in contact with social workers? Do they use the system? Do they find it meaningful? And how can we learn from this crisis? Can this crisis tell us something about which kinds of ALMPs are more meaningful than others? And some of the preliminary findings so far is that a majority of the interview persons and the survey respondents say that they feel relieved about not having to live up to the demands, partly because some of the demands were usually experienced as not particularly meaningful. So applying for jobs you don't want to have, applying for jobs that's really outside of your professional field, those sorts of activities can be experienced as meaningless. So not having to do that is actually quite nice for these people. They also report having a stronger sense of agency, because when they apply for jobs now, they actually seek out the ones they really want to, and they focus on those instead of sort of doing a lot of like superficial applications. They have surprisingly a lot of contact with counselors during this time, and they report the relation to the social workers is a lot more meaningful now, because it's based on a voluntary interaction instead of it being solely structured by a system logic, that the social workers knows which kinds of questions to answer at what point in time, etc., etc. They also report increasing worries about consequences for future labor markets and rising insecurities, also as an effect of the crisis. And we don't know the range of the crisis yet, how much the labor market will be affected by it. So what I would like you to discuss now is what are some of the potential blind spots in the studies, and also perhaps your ideas about an alternative unemployment system. Thank you very much for your attention so far.
If anyone has any questions for Sabina, you can, yep, I see we have one.
Yeah. Where do I see the question?
You can just click the Q&A button at the bottom of the toolbar. It's right next to the leave button.
There we go. Yes. Hi, Niklas. Could you say a bit more about why the labor movement and our unions agreed to the flexicurity system in the first place? What was the premise of it and it for the employees? Was flexibility regarded as psychologically desirable, and do you see meaningful conceptual alternatives to flexicurity? Thank you very much, Niklas, for the question. I think that the flexibility part is probably more so on the side of the companies. So that gives the companies in Denmark this flexibility to hire and fire in regards to what are the demands on the market. So you don't see many companies having to lock down and capitulate due to too many salaries they have to pay. So that part, I think, has never really been something that was particularly understood as psychologically desirable. As to your last part of the question, any meaningful alternatives to the flexicurity system, we are discussing now that perhaps instead of having a range of differentiated systems, some helping people who are unemployed, others helping people who are unemployed and perhaps suffer from other things such as psychiatric diagnoses or poverty and so on, it might make more sense to have a system that at least secures all citizens an amount of money without much communication with the state and without having to live up to a lot of demands. That said, it might be possible to develop the flexicurity system in a way that makes it sustainable and perhaps even provides a better buffer in these more precarious labor markets than what we've seen in other countries that don't have this system rolled out on beforehand. So the logic of the development of the flexicurity model, I think, is kind of dissociated from what it means now, but I think that it really presents a promising alternative to these precarious labor markets, in which this is one crisis that makes a lot of people unemployed, but we will probably see more, and it will probably become even more normal to have periods of unemployment during one's trajectory on the labor market. Yes, I hope that answered some of it. Yes. Are there any other questions or?
Thank you so much. The Q&A would still be open, so if there anyone like wants to send any other questions, it will be there. And it was very actually really informative, especially with everything going on. It's good to see things more statistically and from that kind of structure. So thank you very much. I think we can move on to the next panelist.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, and hi everybody.
Thank you very much.
Let me share my PowerPoint with you. I hope that everybody will see my PowerPoint. And okay, first of all, I want to thank Andy Blondin and Kamal Khosravi, which without their help, this presentation would not be prepared. My presentation is about how to understand global crisis situation as an emancipatory scientist. I want to start this presentation by a quote from Marx, which I believe is a very important quote. He said that to be radical is to go to the root of the matter. For man, however, the root is man himself. It appears that there are lots of various types of crises that we can talk about in this conference. I'm sure that many scholars have talked about many of these crises, from grand crisis of climate change to more small and specific crises in everyday life, like the unemployed and those who are struggling with COVID-19. But my dear colleagues, I'm going to raise our attention to another set of crises, which we believe resolving them is, can you hear me? I think the connection was lost right now. I hope that you're seeing me right now, so I continue. I'm going to raise our attention to another set of crises, which we believe resolving them is even more necessary and primary than giant crises we're dealing with. Crisis of historical perspective on human self-emancipation, which is essentially a psychological crisis and crisis of theory. We believe all different types of crises in the course of our global everyday life are different manifestations of these two crises. In this presentation, I'm going to explain these interrelated crises in our contemporary history and propose some methodological and theoretical suggestions, specifically introducing modes of existence and modes of collaboration in order to solve these crises. I'm doing this investigation as practice of mutual appropriating cultural historical activity theory, especially Andy Blondin's ideas, and Iranian Marxist tradition, especially Kamal Khosravi's ideas. In other words, my voice is a critical dialogue between one of the most logically developed theories of chat and Iranian Marxist tradition. If you like, it's a dialogue between East and West, or between Middle Eastern spirit and rest of the world. A critical dialogue between cultures that have experienced colonialism, imperialism, and finally, the final stage of history, globalism, in different ways. I am sure most of us would not perceive this way of theoretical research as a novel one. During the years 1814 and 1819, Goethe was doing a practice which its result was a collection of poems that their concept has been created as a critical dialogue between West and East, specifically Persian culture. I'm using a specific interdisciplinary mode of investigation, which its starting point can be found in Goethe. Goethe wrote West Eastern Divan, but I have no choice but to write East Western Divan. Let's start with Eastern tradition, Iranian Marxist tradition. So we're starting our conversation about twin crisis. What do we mean by crisis of historical perspective on human self-emancipation? I hope you see the PowerPoint very well, but in order to make it better, just see it like this. It is a global crisis. All of the participants in this conference are right now experiencing this crisis, including you, dear listeners. So in order to understand this crisis, I recommend you to search for these arguments in your own subjective experience. In a very exceptional way, the arguments that I have abstracted from my subjective experience as a critical psychologist in Iran is true about your subjective experience too. It doesn't matter you're in Europe, South America, Africa, India, or other continents. These arguments are true about all of our subjective experiences. All of us are dealing with different crises in our everyday life, but none of us have any integrated, universal, or global solution in order to put an end to this nightmare. People have no solution in order to solve the multiform contradictions between human beings themselves and also nature. In the 21st century, we have essentially different subjective experience compared to those who have lived in the early 20th century. In the early 20th century, people's worldview, or Weltanschauung, if you like, had a clear vision of what is the problem with our globe and what is the in order to historically emancipate ourselves. People had a concept of how to emancipate future. That's the issue. Many of these conceptual frameworks of how to emancipate future was based on metaphysical or religious axioms, and some of them were based on ontological categories that have been developed in the history of philosophy. Century was the outcome of collaboration between all the projects and all the activists that try to emancipate their future. By looking at the history of different regions, one can find many examples of socialist, nationalist, religious, and other forms of social revolution, social movements, and social non-movements. The term that Laya in the next presentation will talk about it in detail. But right now, at the 2020, the concept of how to emancipate future, the worldview or the Weltanschauung itself is in crisis. Most of us have abandoned of emancipating humankind and have retreated to post-humanistic theories of emancipating individual identities. Women, Black, LGBT, refugee, disability, indigenous societies, trees, oceans, jungles, rivers, penguins, pandas, technologies, and so on. These are individual identities. This retreat, whether we like it or not, is a symptom of our crisis of historical perspective of human self-emancipation. It is worth noticing that the reason that we don't know how we can save the earth and humans as soon as possible is our retreat to post-humanistic theories. The entire earth, including its problems, is right now the product of humankind. There's nothing essentially non-human anymore in our earth. Hence, in order to emancipate the earth from all the disastrous effects of humankind, it is necessary to emancipate humankind from the essential basis of its own civilization. In other words, human self-emancipation includes emancipation of entire product of humankind too. So let me show the crisis of historical perspective in some examples. Some of us active in social movements related to climate change crisis have the experience of confusion about strategies and tactics of struggling for Earth. For example, it appears that oil industries have no intention of listening to climate crisis activists, the states, or any other authorities. And no one has any feasible plan for shutting down oil production immediately. How can we solve this problem? Another example, WHO in late January had called for global emergency and importance of quick global response. Global response includes shutting down inessential companies and economic activities, exercising global physical distancing, lockdown of affected regions, social solidarity, and so on. But WHO had, unfortunately, absolutely no feasible plan for realizing these objects and emancipating humans from this situation. Consequently, we faced global pandemic of COVID-19. All of the local, national, and international projects from a social psychological point of view are experiencing the crisis of historical perspective on human self-emancipation. Now let's go to another crisis, the other crisis. Distinct but interrelated to the previous crisis, we are dealing with the crisis of theory in emancipatory social science. What is this crisis? Not only we cannot create a unified and enlightening picture of our subject matter, human social life, but also we are unable to transform it. Our categories are failing to represent the true relation between social elements and factors of reality. Emancipatory social science in 21st century have retreated to methodological individualism. Take the example of intersectionality. It is presumed in this mode of investigation, intersectionality, that each category that expresses the specific kind of oppression, like gender, race, class, etc., has its own ontological origin, which its essential definitions should be extracted independent of other categories that express other oppressions. It seems that each oppression belongs to a different world, and then these entities from different worlds are going to intersect to each other, just like some cars crashing in crossroads. Unlike the metaphysical axioms of theory of intersectionality, we are living in a social life that all these oppressions are internally related to each other in a single and unified totality. This is also true about apparently one of the most advanced concepts of social theories that attempts to understand humans' activities in everyday life. The Weberian concept of life conduct, Lebensführung, appropriated by German Scandinavian critical psychology, is about understanding humans' struggle to integrate contradictory but originally independent aspects of social life. For example, economic activities objectified in the market, political activities objectified in the state, ethical activities objectified in religious institutions, and so on. These concepts have been appropriated by Munich sociological group and then appropriated by Klaus Holzkamp, and then it's now the central concept in the conceptual framework of German Scandinavian critical psychology or kritische Psychologie. Here also one can see the problem of methodological individualism. It is true that the process of everyday living consists of integrating contradictory aspects. But these aspects are all parts of a single unified world of everyday life. We are still failing to prepare the theory that enables us to make critique of social life. What we mean by critique is not only making enlightenment about our subject matter, but also transformation of it. In early 20th century, people have the sufficient theoretical tool to make a critique of social life. For example, 19th century social science like Marx, Engels, and Hobson's political economic studies, Hegel's logic, and rich Russian literature like Chernyshevsky helped Vladimir Lenin and other revolutionaries in Russia to develop their understanding of the global crisis situation and to transform the global social situation. In 20th century, theory of emancipatory social science was not in crisis. This theory enabled Lenin to write April thesis in 1917, and by that theory, they make October Revolution. Now let's look at the 21st century, the last April. Trump, as a typical political leader, suggested us to inject disinfectant to our blood. And Tedros Adhanom, director of WHO, said that we only have limited power to give advice to governments. It is up to them whether to take them seriously or not. And more important than these political projects that have retreated into real politics, current social revolutions, current social movements and social non-movements are unable to reach a global integrity in order to perform the global ethical politics of 21st century, or let's say 21st century's global revolution. In conclusion, not only all the local, national, and international projects are psychologically experiencing crisis of historical perspective, but also we lack proper and prepared theoretical tools to critique our subject matter, human social life. Now, very briefly, allow me to enter to my next step of presentation, talking a little about mode of existence and mode of collaboration. Kamal Khosravi, an Iranian Marxist scholar, argues that in order to solve the crisis of theory, we need to start building our conceptual framework from a social ontological standpoint. An ontology that specifically belongs to our contemporary stage of history. It is capitalism. One of the categories that has been neglected in Marx's works, but is very essential in order to build the social ontological layer of our conceptual framework, is mode of existence, or Existensweise in German. Kamal defines this category like this. What we mean by mode of existence is the way the state, the space of presence, the existence of thing, event, relation, or reality in its totality, including all aspects that can be referred to roots, basis, foundation, essence, and form of appearance, form of realization, presence, and also, that's the important part for us as psychologists, all their manifestation in collaboration with consciousness. Now, having this definition in mind, let's look at this part of Das Kapital. It's chapter 13, volume 1. Being independent of each other, the laborers, the workers, are isolated persons who enter into relations with the capitalists, but not with one another. This cooperation begins only with the labor process, but they have then ceased to belong to themselves. On entering that process, they become incorporated with capital. As cooperators, as members of a working organism, they are but spatial modes of existence of capital. That's the point. It means, Marx says that laborers in capitalist societies are spatial modes of existence of capital. It means that laborers are spatial ways of presence of capital. It's also true about the unemployed, or those people that are right now not working. Just like money, capitalists, raw materials like oil, trees, water, etc., and means of production including technology. They're not ontologically independent entities, but spatial modes of existence of capital. Does Marx only tell us that, we scholars, that humans are social creatures, or communism is the final stage of history? These are not the core ideas that Marx developed in Das Kapital. Marx's theory of value is an attempt to provide us an account of social ontology of capitalist societies, which can be used in order to rebuild our emancipatory social science in 21st century. Now, based on this ontological layer, which specifically explains contemporary circle stage, let's build another layer of our conceptual framework, unit of analysis of capitalist societies. In his preface to Das Kapital, Marx says that in bourgeois society, the commodity form of product of labor, or value form of commodity, is the economic sell form. Marx, by introducing the category of sell form, starts its investigation of bourgeois society from its simplest social practice, which is exchange of labor products. In our everyday life, we are practicing exchange of labor products many times with other people. To put it more precisely, we are not doing this exchange with other people, but with other projects. Different entities consist of aggregates of human actions with their own motives and objects. We exchange our labor. Labor with the wage that we get from our company. A company, of course, is a project with its own object. And then we exchange our wage with different commodities that we need to use. We get these commodities from different companies. Consider your local supermarkets, Amazon, etc. Although we human beings are doing the simplest practice in our everyday life in order to meet our needs, although we collaborate with different projects in order to maintain and enhance our lives, but a special kind of this mode of collaboration is not only exchange of labor products, but also valorization of capital. In order to understand this, we need to shift our individualized subjective standpoint into the standpoint of a smallest unit of capital, a company. A company's main motive for collaboration, which this motive appears to us the main target of each company, being productive and profit making. A company is doing this process by converting its money into commodities and then by selling those commodities, hence making extra money. This is the first appearance of process of valorization, which everybody is familiar with. In brief, from our own subjective standpoints, the dominant mode of production, the dominant mode of collaboration in our everyday life is and integrates our daily life. This is, we believe, the core of conduct of everyday life. And from the standpoint of a unit of capital, the dominant mode of collaboration is also exchange of labor product, but in order to valorize capital. Mode of collaboration helps us to conceptualize everyday life based on a specific social ontology of capitalist society and the unit of analysis of capitalist society in order to understand our social life in its totality. It is obvious that every project in capitalist society is not a capitalist project, and every collaboration that we do in our life is not necessarily exchange of labor products. However, other projects and other modes of collaboration should be understood originally interrelated with the dominant projects and dominant mode of collaboration in capitalist society. Projects that their main motive is not valorization, for example, projects of surveillance, projects related to women's suppression, boycott of minority groups and other forms of oppression, should be understood in their collaboration with capitalist projects. The state, the church, and the markets do not belong to different worlds. This is the main issue. They are constituting a single, united world. So the final conclusion, I am suggesting that we should solve these twin crises: crisis of historical perspective, which is essentially a psychological issue, and crisis of theory of social theory of emancipation. And I'm suggesting that we can appropriate these two categories, mode of existence of capital and modes of collaboration between capitalist projects, in order to enrich our understanding of capitalist social life. The final conclusion, global crisis situation in its essentiality is the crisis of companies trying to maintain the deadly process of valorization, even if it costs destruction of earth and lives of millions of people. I believe global warming, wars, pandemics, and other crises cannot be understood without the relation to the process of valorization. So let's write paragraphs or even chapters of the future psychology together. Thank you for listening to this presentation. So how can I stop screening? Okay.
Thank you so much for your presentation. The floor is also now open for questions, and I think someone's hands was raised. Oh, never mind. And if there aren't any questions at the moment, we can still have we're open for anyone. But thank you very much. I think we can move on to the next presentation.
Yeah. next presentation is Laya. We have to change our place.
Okay. Oh, there is actually a question.
Question?
Yes.
Okay.
Do you want me to read it or?
Okay. Nicholas is asking, I think. Hi, Nicholas. Thanks for much critical food for thought, Sohrab. You write that the goal must be an emancipation of humankind from the essential basis of its own civilization. What do you mean by that? And how does this include the earth more specifically? Could you kindly expand this on this? Okay. Very good question. This is the thing that I'm right now thinking about it, and this is the call to all the researchers that help me and collaborate with me in this issue. First of all, I'm searching for an understanding of the internal relation between Earth system, or let's say Gaia in the way that James Lovelock is talking about it, and its relation to the capitalist mode of production. This is a very puzzling issue that, to be honest with you, right now I cannot give a clear answer, but I hope that in the next presentation or in the next article, I would work on it more. So I know that this was not an answer to Nicholas, but I just want to say that this is also the question that I have also in my mind. Yeah. So if you're okay, then we can change for the next presenter. Okay.
There is actually another question.
Another question. Okay. Could you, Ernst? First of all, hi, Ernst. Could you explain a bit more the methodological individualism of the concept of conduct of everyday life? Isn't it a concept exactly trying to overcome it? Yes, you're right. It appears that this concept is trying to overcome this individualistic understanding of everyday life. But based on my research into the origins of this concept in Weber, I understood that Weber also have this problem of methodological individualism in this way, that he understands each domain of social life as ontologically independent of other domains. For example, Weber, you know that Weber says that, for example, economic activities manifested in the market institution has its own independent logic than the political activities of individuals that manifested in a state with its own individual, its own independent origins. So appropriating life conduct from Weber into the rich tradition of conduct of everyday life, I believe has this contradiction in itself, that although it tries to overcome this methodological individualism, but by using a concept which is originally based on individualism, unfortunately have failed to completely overcome this issue. I hope that I could open it up more in a recent article about this issue. Then another question is coming. Thank you for your plea for a universal emancipation and raising questions of social ontology. However, I think the crisis of human emancipation is not restricted to a psychological issue. If I understood you correctly, this was your claim. As far as theory is concerned, universal projects have been discredited. Probably this is also a way of subverting emancipatory projects. What do you say? Well, first of all, yes, I agree with Gordana that the problem, the crisis of human emancipation is not just restricted to psychological issues, but a psychological issue, or let's say the problem of social psychology, of having a perspective of emancipated future, is one of the problems that I believe we as psychologists have to work on it. But you're right, there are many other crises that I think people in other domains of life can work on it more. I'm trying to answer so fast not to make the time of other presentators. So we can talk about it more. Thank you. Yeah. So if there is no other question, anyway, I suggest if you have any other question, I would be very happy to hear it in the Slack or in my email. So let's go to the next presentation. Thank you very much.
Okay, hi everybody. I want to today talk about the role of social movements in understanding the water crisis situation. Social movements under normal circumstances are always dealing with separation from different established situations, institutions, families, companies, religions, and states. Now with the COVID-19 pandemic, suppression of social movement is getting more intensified. In search of a better understanding of global crisis situation and the process of social change in the era of increased separation and state surveillance, I am going to illustrate the category of social non-movement, which I have found as a useful analytical tool for understanding social change. I have encountered this category during my investigation, specifically into the Iranian feminist movement and more generally the global feminist movement. And more generally the global feminist movement from reading other trials work. Quarantine and being at home have made this surveillance much more intensified than the past. States now have seemingly valid arguments for monitoring people's activities. The governments are actively exercising control in order to maintain social distancing. As Kitty Bottasari observes, we actually need is not social distancing, but physical distancing and social solidarity. So, the intensification of state surveillance, militarization of social services, and loss of the private sphere of life are among recent problems that social movements are encountering. Although COVID-19 has influenced all people and there are overwhelming problems, children, men, both people and LGBT people have been involved directly. But as a feminist, I want to focus on women, the problems that this disease has brought over there. These issues make me curious about women and feminist movements. In this agitated situation that women have a lot of problems, what will happen to all movements, especially feminist ones? How can we protect our movements and help our movements develop. To answer these questions, I will specifically look at Iranian feminist movement and more generally the global movement of the feminism of 99%, for getting inspiration and information that can be helpful. The Iranian feminist movement after the Islamic Revolution has been intensively oppressed. The progressive customs that have been institutionalized during the 1960s and 70s, like freedom war, have been defeated by the new set of Islamic customs and laws. Hijab became mandatory and all women were obliged to respect these rules. The revolts which protested for the freedom of women and their independence were silenced by the government. Lots of feminists were arrested and went to jail. Lots of them lost their jobs and couldn't finish their education. Although one of these feminists, Shirin Ebadi, for her ceaseless defense of women's rights, was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, it didn't help women to become powerful enough to change the reactionary Islamic laws in Iran. Iranian feminists were active contributors to the civil democratic green movement in 2008. However, since then, most of them are suffering from banishment, long years of prison, torture, and persecution. Although this wave of massive operation destroyed the fragile body of Iranian feminist movement, the development of progressive ideas among Iranian feminists continued in their daily social non-movement. It is necessary to equip ourselves with analytical tools that enable us to investigate social movements in the situation of global crisis and hyper-suppression. I am going to propose the concept of social non-movement as a proper analytical tool to investigate the inherent cell of social movements within everyday life. I appropriate this category based on my lived experience as a feminist activist in Iran, observing women struggling for their rights in their everyday life, and I also find the proper concept of explanation of my experience in Asif Fayyad's work, especially his conceptualization of social non-movement. Understanding social non-movement as a transformative process happening in our everyday life can help us to probably solve the current problems related to global crisis situation. As also observed, in general, non-movements refer to the collective actions of non-collective actors. They embody shared practices of large numbers of individuals whose fragmented but similar activities trigger one social event. Even though these practices are rarely guided by an ideology or recognizable leadership and their organizations. The term movement implies that social non-movements in significant consequential elements of social movement, yet they constitute distinct entities. How do we explain the logic of practicing movement? Social movements, specifically those operating in the politically open and ecologically advanced Western societies, are defined as the organized, sustained, self-conscious challenge to existing authority. Very often, they are embedded in particular organizations and guided by certain ideologies. They pursue certain frames, follow specific leadership, and adopt particular repertories or means and methods of claim making. So, we understand, obviously, non-movement is different from social movement. What then differentiates the type of non-movements that we have discussed here so far? What are the distinct features of non-movements in general? Non-movements will be influential when they are challenging authoritarian states. Non-movements have four elements. First, they are action-oriented rather than ideologically driven. They are silent and they present their demands personally, not guided by groups. Second, whereas in social movements, leaders usually mobilize the constituencies to put pressure on authorities to meet their demands, non-movements actors directly practice what they claim despite government sanctions. Thus, this is not politics of protest.
Can I interrupt for a second? I'm really sorry. The connection is a bit laggy. So maybe like try turning off the camera and try again, or like turn it on again, because it's a bit choppy with like the audio.
Okay, sure.
So sorry.
Okay.
Yes, I think it's going to be better, but like we can't see the screen now.
Could you see now?
It's loading, I believe. Yeah, now we can. Yeah. Okay, we got it. Okay, thank you. So sorry for the interruption.
So sorry.
Thank you.
Okay, and I was talking about the four elements of non-movements. First, they are action-oriented rather than ideological driven. They are silent and they present their demands personally, not guided by groups. Second, whereas in social movements, leaders usually mobilize the constituencies to put pressure on authorities to make their demands. In non-movements, actors directly practice what they claim, despite government sanctions. Thus, this is not politics of protest, but politics of practice. And the third one is that non-movements don't have extraordinary acts like those we see in social movements. For example, campaigning, signing petitions, or other things. Non-movements are the actions involved with usual ordinary daily acts. For example, Iranian women, by doing ordinary actions that are not encouraged in Islamic culture, are participating in development of women's social condition. And the fourth and the important one is that these practices are not carried out by small groups of people acting on the political margins. Rather, they are common practices of everyday life carried out by millions of people who albeit remain fragmented. Since we are talking about common practices of everyday life in big numbers, the consequential effect of these transformative practices would be the true change in norms and rules of any society. And now, examples of social non-movements of people. Can be found when we look at the poor that are building illegal houses connecting to hot water and electricity lines without the state permission and without paying the bills, or spreading their merchandise out in urban sidewalks. We can also witness international immigrants who have passed the borders to live a new life. Or the woman who tried to go to universities, play sports, find a job, or choosing their partner without family permission. And also the youth who admire how they like, listen to what they want, and go wherever they like. All represent some core practices of non-movements in the Middle East and similar world areas. How do non-movements impact the state? and be about important movements. Millions of people are doing these actions, although they are individualized and personal actions. And when the suitable time for organizing these individual activities come, they can join together and form a contentious politics and become a social movement. I should admit that the importance of non-movement is not just becoming a movement. The non-movement has its own values and priorities. Each action has its own immediate motivation. Non-movements can change the systems and manipulate the power of states, and it is not easy for the states to always suppress that. The state is forced to respect the rules or change something in itself. Speaking of such non-movements, the collective actions of non-collective actors is in this manner is not mean to downplay the significance of organized and sustained women's social movements, nor is it at the same time to value the impact of non-movements in comparison to the conventional social movement. My intention, rather than, has been to highlight the mode of operation particular. Mobilization under social and political constraints. And come back to Iranian feminist movements. One can argue that the feminist social movement in Iran right now is continuing its Bildungsroman via everyday transformative activities of women, or let's say the social non-movement. In other words, under the authoritarian patriarchal states, whether secular or religious, women's activism for gender equality is likely to take on the form of non-movement. What do we mean by everyday transformative activities? Authoritarian regimes and conservative men impose severe restrictions on women making gender claims in a sustained fashion, establishing independent organizations and publications, lobbying, managing public protests, mobilizing ordinary women, acquiring funding and resources, or establishing links with international solidarity groups. Recognizing such constraints on organized campaigns, women have tended to pursue a different strategy. One that involves intimately the mundane practices of everyday life, such as pursuing education, sports, arts, music, or working outside the home. These women did not refrain from performing the usually male work of civil servants, professionals, and public actors, from carrying out chores such as banking, taking cars to mechanics, or negotiating with builders. They did not stop jogging in public parks, or climbing Mount Everest, or contesting and winning in male-dominated car racing despite unsuitable dress codes. So women established themselves as public actors, subverting the conventional public-private gender divide. It is worth noticing that this Iranian feminist movement that I am elaborating in this presentation is part of middle-class project of Iran. Unfortunately, I have no systematic information about social non-movement of women within the poor. This may be the subject of another research. It is an important question to answer that why scholars in Iran and maybe other places in the world systematically have ignored social process within the poorest layers of society. However, it is very important to understand their problems because most of revolutionary events in the world are significantly related to the poorest layers of each society. So, the more Iranian women do the common practices of empowering themselves and struggling for their daily rights, the more patriarchal norms would be fragile. This is also true about global movement of 99%. Social scientists who are following this social movement, in addition to their extraordinary activities, like having campaigns and the action-oriented, ordinary, and is it okay, my voice? Oriented, ordinary and common practice of women in their daily and ordinary process of transforming the norms and rules of social reproduction. In conclusion, I come back to COVID-19 and the global crisis situation. How can social movements survive? How we can keep going under the pressure of states and fear of diseases? And how the concept of non-movement can help us to understand the transformative aspect of everyday life. Look at the actions of women in the period of COVID-19. They help each other for hygiene. They help each other by teaching how to use the mask and gloves and how to protect the house and body. Of course, they are lending money and helping in financial way. As I have seen, single independent women help other single independent women who have been fired in their jobs to don't lose their independence. Other women help old people that couldn't buy grocery and buying for them. As I have seen, some women help their friends who have been sick and got COVID-19. They buy everything that they need and cook for them and put it behind the door. This way of helping that have been made by daily works of women, but it has its own impact and can build the solidarity that can challenge and change the states. People, and the final conclusion, people in the Middle East and specifically in Iran are alive thanks to non-movements. Intensified surveillance never makes people silent and static. They ask for their demands just by their everyday works. In this COVID-19 situation, we can understand from these people how to be alive and dynamic. We should follow our revolutionary causes even in our daily routines, like Iranian women under the pressure of hijab and sexist rules that do their routines as revolutionary acts. Non-movement is not something that we had never done it or some extraordinary work. It is something that we do every day of our lives. In this period that COVID-19 have destroyed and weakened all the movements, we should be able to see the validity of human activism within the skin of social non-movements. And in the period of COVID-19, as much as people do their routine works that challenge the states, they can make their movements alive like each drop of rain and makes a stormy river. Thanks for your attention.
Okay, thank you so much. I think, as always, we'll have the Q&A like open. And sorry about the interruption in the middle of the presentation, but the audio is really laggy. So we'll leave the Q&A open, and if not, we can like just. Oh, there we go. Another question. Would you like me to?
Yeah. Nicholas. Hi, Nicholas. Very interesting talk. Thanks a lot, Laya. I very much like your idea of focusing more on everyday transformative activities. And I actually believe the conduct of everyday life concept may be helpful for that. But But I would like to ask you also, because I only was able to hear half of your audio. Why do call it non-movement after all? Also, these activities do move people, but picking up on Sohrab perhaps rather as a form of self-emancipation rather than emancipation that is to save others. You want that I explain more about non-movement and why the name is non-movement? As you know, I borrowed this concept from Asif Bayat, and Asif Bayat worked a lot on concepts of concepts in Iran and the Middle East. And non-movements are about the, as he said, the collective actions of non-collective actors, the daily works that we do in our life that can challenge their states and change their states. For example, when we look at the Iranian women, that they aren't allowed and they are not encouraged to do the same works that, for example, the European women are doing. They can just do some works like, for example, going to universities, becoming the masters, and doing some somehow it looks that they are ordinary works, but they are not for Iranian one. By doing this kind of works, they can challenge their states. Because of this, as you can see in other places in Middle East, they are really forced to use very complete hijab, but in Iran, it is not the same. Because of the women works, I think, I don't know how I explain, but as you can see, my writing is better than speaking. So if I can't explain good, really, excuse me. Okay, thank you a lot. If there isn't any question. Yeah, Nicholas, I will do it. Thank you very much for question. Have a nice time.
Okay, thank you so much for your talk. I think now we can move on to the next panelist. That's okay. I think we have, yeah.
I think my presentation is the last presentation.
Whenever you're ready.
Yeah, is it visible?
Yes, it is.
The presentation?
Yeah, it's working. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I would like to thank the other participants for such wonderful papers. I could not ask questions because somehow I can't type in the Q&A. I didn't get the option for it. So hello, everyone. I am Rimi Nandy. I am an assistant professor in the Department of English at Adamas University, India. And I will be talking about Facebook and the COVID-19 crisis, building solidarity through community feeling. How Facebook as a social network is helping in building this community feeling. Just a second. So because of the lockdown and social isolation, we are unable to connect to anyone physically apart from our families. We cannot go out, we cannot mix with our friends. So in such a situation, I think Facebook has come to the forefront, and there are reports suggesting that there's a surge of activity on Facebook. The use of Facebook has gone up during this period of lockdown, and it is providing the platform which is helping people stay connected to each other and provide this sense of togetherness and sense of belonging to a particular community, irrespective of the boundaries and borders of countries. So these are some of the main issues that I will be talking about. So first, I'll begin with the concept of collaborative culture. So the present age, with the intervention of the internet, there was already a movement towards a culture which is based entirely on collaboration. And instead of consumers and producers, we now have what we call the prosumers. So the consumers are also the ones who are producing the data that is being consumed. So because of the sudden appearance of the global pandemic, which went out of hand very quickly, there is a forced movement towards the virtual platform. Okay. Not all countries were prepared for it, and still there are a lot of people who do not have access to the internet, and by virtue of that, to the virtual platform. Okay. Still, I believe that this particular pandemic has pushed the very culture of communication and the manner in which social networks are used. Connected to this, I will like to talk about the sense of belongingness. So one of the main reasons for the use of social network is this sense that I belong to a particular community. There is always this idea that we have to perform ourselves. In this respect, I would like to refer to Malinowski's concept of fatigue communion, where he is talking about conversations or communication over social network as being only targeted towards forming this bond of companionship. And on this particular social media platform, I'm focusing mainly on Facebook here. So the division between the author and the consumer, the amateur and the professionals, is slowly being eradicated. Okay, because of the various trends that are taking place on Facebook, and because people are forced to sort of move over to Facebook to while away their time, to feel there is some kind of movement in their life in the absence of movement. Okay, so individual identity is what we try to construct through the use of social network, and that happens only when we interact with another person. Our identity is built based on how we interact with the other people on our friend list and our friends network. So the global pandemic has created this space where social networks have become phenomenal in helping to keep people connected to each other, even though we are being forced to stay in isolation. Okay, so there is this feeling of loneliness, there is this feeling of hopelessness, which is slowly becoming a shared experience across the world. It's not something just associated with a particular country or a particular area. It has become a global phenomena on its own, this feeling of helplessness and loneliness in the face of corona outbreak. Now, with respect to this, the concept of belongingness, which I had discussed, just introduced earlier, I would like to show this particular diagram, which shows Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Okay, so this shows the category or the level of requirements which are true to every human being. Okay, so after the physiological and safety regards, the third most important thing for human beings is the sense of belonging. Okay, so that is where again that concept of social networking comes in. So with this sense of belongingness, you also have the concepts of perceived belongingness and perceived enjoyment. So this is based on the theory of technology adoption model. I have taken this from there. So perceived belongingness, because there is nothing concrete which tells us that yes, you are a part of this particular community. It is entirely an imagined space. And as users, we perceive this sense of community. We feel when we are enacting our identity, we feel that there are people who share the similar kind of tastes or the similar kind of loneliness and helplessness, which slowly gives rise to this perceived notion of enjoyment. When we access Facebook, it is mostly for what we would call fun, okay, or enjoyment. It is not usually restricted to any formal kind of work. It is always mostly informal communication that is taking place over Facebook. So this becomes that space which provides that sense of enjoyment. And within this, you also have something called ludic self, which is a theory propounded by Josh D. Mull. And he talks about how, as users of Facebook, each of us performs a role. It's like playing a game with the other users, playing a game of identity construction. And connected to this, you have the concept, Bakhtin's concept of carnivalesque. So Facebook becomes this space of carnival where you do not have any rules as such, except that there are no rules. Okay, so that is the prevalent rule, that it is that space which provides anonymity, and it is also the space which provides you a platform to share your talent, to share whatever you feel like. There is nothing that you are not sort of not allowed to share, not everything obviously, but you could choose to share music covers, you could choose to share painting, cooking recipes, videos of cooking. So it showcases, it helps in uh, performing this identity and showcasing yourself. So that is where this sense of enjoyment comes in. So during this time of lockdown, when people feel this isolation and it is being imposed upon them, there is no way you can break this isolation, go out and enjoy yourself if you feel like it. So in this kind of a situation, Facebook becomes essential for bringing together people across the world who are facing the same situation. Now, this sense of belongingness also comes from something called the informational support, which Facebook provides. Informational support refers to something which is intangible. We cannot say that it is more of an abstract notion. So the idea that you find some kind of peer support from your friends, from the network that you follow, even if you do not know the person personally, there is this sense of support, which is trying to help uh, mm, each other to overcome this crisis situation. And that is what is bringing this kind of community, which is sharing solidarity, a space of solidarity. Okay, so these are some of the trends. Now, it is very obviously not easy to extract data from Facebook, so I had to make do with these screenshots that I have taken from public posts. Now, there are numerous trends that are on Facebook right now, which have been created because of the lockdown situation. So the first picture is of videos shared by this 11-year-old girl, Carolina, of her playing violin from inside her house and playing instruments along with her entire family. And that again gives a sense of familiarity, and also the fact that it is okay to be in this lockdown situation, and there are other ways to cope up with it. The second group of pictures is of this saxophone player uh, who is performing from his balcony in Italy. And he is performing various music covers, and it became a sensation. There were people sharing it, um, uh, sharing various videos of him playing the saxophone from his balcony, and all the other neighbors joining in, clapping, which is again creating this community feeling. The last picture that I have included is of Dalgona Coffee Challenge. Okay, so the concept of Dalgona coffee started in South Korea, and then it spread across the world. And people are making this particular uh, beverage and sharing pictures of it, sharing videos of themselves making this particular beverage, which is again, irrespective of which country you belong to, is sort of connecting everyone together and helping them share their time, their experience during the lockdown. So what I mentioned about the informational support also comes from this fact of sharing experience, sharing your personal experience from day to day. There are a few other trends that I would like to talk about. I could not get pictures of those. So one of the very important trends that have become very prominent is celebrities sharing videos of themselves spending time with their family. So celebrities have always been someone which we do not entirely connect to, but we sort of look up to. So for the first time, there is this space where the consumers are allowed to enter the private space of the celebrity lifestyle. And the fact that they are also sharing time with their family, they're spending time with the family, and they're also giving these messages of support to everyone um, about staying inside the house and spending time singing, painting. We have videos of Anthony Hopkins playing the piano for his cat, or sharing his paintings, uh, doing stand-up comedy acts. We also have videos of The Rock spending time with his daughter singing uh, the song of Maui to entertain her. With respect to India, also you have various Bollywood actors like Ayushmann Khurrana playing the piano, reciting poetry, or another important thing is celebrity cooking. The fact that they have ventured inside uh, the kitchen and they are doing something which is very normal for all the others, non-celebrities, if we could say that, usually perform. There is again another this sudden craze for the series Money Heist. So Money Heist has been airing for some time now, and there was this sudden surge in a fan base created for Money Heist, and especially the song Bella Ciao. There are different versions of Bella Ciao being shared all over the internet. There are videos, clips from Money Heist being shared. So all of this is moving towards this sense of creating a community feeling where everyone sort of comes together to fight this crisis situation that human beings have not encountered before. There have been pandemics earlier, but the situations were very much different. Um, you could say because of the number of transportations that are available, there is a global movement taking place, which has led to a quick spread of the pandemic, which was not the case in the previous pandemics. If we could, I think the last one was the Spanish flu pandemic that had happened. So it was not entirely a global pandemic as such. So we could say that in a sense, this is the first globally experienced pandemic, and that is showing that every person, irrespective of which culture they belong to, there is this sense of there is this want to belong to a particular group, because there is this absence of physical proximity, absence of this feeling of going out or experiencing life with a group. So finally, I would like to talk about the care button, which has been introduced in Facebook. Okay, so earlier, the only buttons that were available was a like button, a love button, angry button, and the one which showed that you're laughing. Now, this particular button has been introduced to show that as a user of the Facebook platform, when you are viewing a particular post, when you react with this particular emoticon of care, it shows that you matter to people, that there is connection still, and there are people who are, uh, you know, mm, take time to show that they care for you. So this particular button was introduced only in the wake of the COVID-19 situation, because suddenly you have the requirement of showing or expressing the fact that you connect virtually, and you connect emotionally in a sense, because each one of us is going through the similar kind of situations in our own life. And there is this sense of fear, there's this sense of hopelessness, and obviously isolation will always lead to a kind of loneliness. So in order to counter this, people have turned towards Facebook, and they have started with these trends. Mm, these are the trends that I refer to were just a few of the many trends that are on Facebook at present, and it will obviously require a much broader research. But what I try to do here is how this sharing and this particular emoticon of caring have brought people together in this bond of community. Okay, albeit it's a imagined community, but there is this sense of solidarity somewhere, because each of us are probably doing almost the similar things in our day-to-day life. So in conclusion, again, I would like to reiterate the point which I started with. In the present situation, virtual communities are slowly becoming the reality. Okay, as we move away from the real community, the real communication, we are slowly moving towards this virtual communication, which is becoming the reality of the society. And also, we are depending on networking and sharing in order to create a sense of solidarity. Obviously, we can refer to this conference itself, that people are connecting together from various parts of the world, which might not have been possible in a different situation. Because it has moved onto a virtual platform, there is this sense of community feeling where researchers and academicians are coming together to share their research interest based on a broad outline. So this is my take on how Facebook has helped to bring this sense of belongingness and community uh, in the present situation of the lockdown. These are some of the texts and articles I have referred to for this particular presentation. Thank you for being so patient and listening to me for this entire expanse of time. If anybody has any question, I'll be happy to take them.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. I found it really interesting. Hopefully we'll get some questions to expand on some of the things that you were talking about. Ah, here's one.
Oh, yeah.
Are you able to find the Q&A function at the bottom?
No.
It's just at the bottom, right next to the share screening and the leave button.
I can't find the.
Okay. Then I can just read you the question if you like.
Yeah.
Oh, you want it? Okay, perfect. Oh,
yeah. Could you just read out the question? I can't.
Sorry. Thanks for your colorful social media analysis. May I ask whether you also stumbled over posts that were very non-solidaric and that may have exacerbated the experience situation of lockdown?
Thank you for this question, Nicholas. So there's something that Professor Hannah Merithio had mentioned yesterday, that there is this presence of an in-between narrative which is not always captured. And in case of a Facebook narrative, I think it beautifully shows how there is a lot which is not captured on Facebook. Yes, there are posts like you could say of people suffering in the context of India, migrant workers who are suffering a lot, who do not have food, who are traveling by foot from one state to the other. So these are experiences of the migrant workers which are being shared from the point of view of a consumer looking at data. But their voice as such does not get reflected onto the Facebook platform. So there is always this need to create this happy feeling on Facebook platform, because of which there is a dearth of capturing situations which might show you a much darker reality of life, because Facebook in a sense is an escape from a reality of life. I hope I have answered your question. Any other questions? Yeah. So I think I was the last presenter in this panel. So what do we do after this? Is there any discussion?
If anyone else would like to make any closing remarks, that would be welcome, but our time is almost up. We end at 1:30, so yeah, if there's anything else anyone would like to say, that's open now, but yeah.
Okay, so
yeah, okay. Then,
thank you for now.
Yeah, thank you for all of our panelists and attendees.
Yeah. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Take care.
You as well.
It was nice participating. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. Thank
Bye.
you.